All right. Shalom, everyone. Happy Wednesday to you. I'm glad you came back. This is the part two of what I started last week. It's a um, lesson that has led me many places and shown me many things that I hadn't thought about. And so I'll be getting into more controversial subjects next week when we talk about the travelers. But right now, I want to just basically help you understand the Nephilim and understand they may not be the same as the giants that are found in Moses's work
Right.
or the Goliath stories or any of those on this side of the flood. But we'll get to that idea in a little bit. But let's go back for a second. In Genesis chapter 6, we talked about the sons of B'nai Elohim. Maybe I started that way. B'nai Elohim, sons of God, interacting with the daughters of man. Now, there were lots of ways that this could have gone. The idea was in the second century of both the Christian and the Jewish understanding, CE, they both came to the conclusion that the book of Enoch should not be taught, should not be read. In fact, I think it was a combination of the fact that neither one wanted the other one to talk about it. But at the bottom line of it is the fact that there were several ways that were looked at. Some wanted to choose to call it the sons of rulers. Some would call it the sons of nobles rather than thinking of angels. And another group wanted to call it, since it's Elohim, that's a judge, and they did not want to have judges. And the fourth way was that these sons of God were actually Seth's children versus Cain's children. But there's a whole lot of problems that goes along with each and every one of those thoughts. But let us just keep it simple. Let's just keep it at the sons of God were what we would call angels. The book of Job, which is one of the oldest books in the Tanakh. In fact, many people believe it was written by Moses himself. Job, in his second chapter, in the 6th verse, specifically talks about B'nai Ha'ilam, specifically talks about them as being angels. Now, he's not the only one who does, but he's the easiest one to find. Now, as you're going through this whole idea, I want you to think about the fact that the story began by the B'nai Elohim were called watchers. That is the term that was used by Enoch. Now, Enoch maybe got his term or his word from the book of Daniel, because it appears as though Daniel is older than Enoch in terms of age of the book. So if that's true, then what we're looking at, because, well, let me give you the scripture. You remember Daniel chapter 4 in verse 10, 14, and 20, these angel beings are called watchers. And so that's where that comes from. Now, as we go through this, it's in the Aramaic. The word watcher in Aramaic is Erim. And it's found when we look at the book of Enoch, is written in, three different ways. In fact, it's found in three different ways. The first book of Enoch was written in Aramaic from the beginning. But much of the book was found at the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the scrolls themselves were ravaged by time, if nothing else. But there were copies that had been made from those that were now in Ethiopia. And so the language went from Aramaic to Ethiopian. And so that's the second place that it goes. Now, the second book of Enoch, because there's three of them, the second book of Enoch was also written in Ethiopian. And it goes on and gives us quite a few details, and I'll talk about those later. And the third book of Enoch was written in a language that does not seem possible that it could be tied originally, but many people say it's part of a trilogy. The third book was written in Slavic languages, Eastern European. So we have three books, all talking about these angels as being watchers. So we have an understanding of who we are. In fact, if you were reading the book of Enoch, which I have two different copies, two different kinds, but the Book of Enoch is fascinating, to say the least. And the first chapters are about the Watchers, but they're not the only ones that are fascinating, because when we get into the others, the parables and into the astronomy, you begin to see that we're talking about, hold your hat, some sort of spacecraft whereby one can actually visit the parts of the universe, as he becomes very specific. We lead ourselves later on into a character called an Anunnaki, who is a combination of El and what they call Yahweh. But that's beside the point. The Book of Watchers, the first chapters of Genesis, and the first 32 chapters or 36 chapters of the Book of Enoch deal with the Watchers and deal with angels altogether. In fact, according to the Book of Enoch, there were only seven levels of angels. They list them as follows. The highest ranking were called the Watchers. The second were called Seraphim. Third were Ophanim. Fourth were Cherubim. Fifth was Hayot. Sixth was Galgalium. And the seventh was Melachim. Where are the archangels? Where did they fit into this? Rambam had 10 levels of angels, not 7. So there was disagreement even in the Jewish camp as to what the angels were and how many of them there were there. But as we begin this process or this story, we begin to come to an understanding that the Book of Watchers is independent from almost all of the books of the Tanakh, except it's found in all the books of the Tanakh. Well, I shouldn't say all. It's found in basically 26 of the books themselves through characters that amplify the Watchers and sayings that come directly out of the first book of Enoch. Now, remember, the Watchers were destroyed, and along with them, all of civilization at the flood, because of 3 basic reasons. I suggested last time the first one was the fact that their makeup and weapons. There was an angel called Asael. Asael descended to earth, and he teaches what they call the forbidden knowledge. And he teaches it to the women about adornment, cosmetics, and all. And to the men, he teaches them war. What's interesting about Azazel is the fact that it's very close to an angel that is talked about during Yom Kippur, who actually is fed one of the 2 scapegoats. His name was Azazel. Azazel. Same character, maybe? I don't know. But anyway, the one thing that we have to know is that his name means God made. God made. Now, this angel then was obviously involved. And I want to read to you a portion from the Book of Enoch itself, the 8th chapter. It goes out to say, and Asael taught men to make swords and daggers and shields and breastplates. He showed them the things that after these and the arts of making them, bracelets and ornaments, and this art of making up the eyes and of beautifying the eyelids, and most of the precious and choice stones, and all kinds of colored dyes. And the world was changed, and there was great impiety and much fornication, and they went astray, and all their ways became corrupt. So in the conversation, Asael spends a lot of his time basically bringing down the level of righteousness of the groups through makeup and lustful thoughts and the idea of war. Now, the second thing that goes on is the fact that we talk about magic and the idea of forbidden knowledge, which takes up only a small part. But again, in Enoch, this time 7th chapter, it says, and they taught them charms and spells and showed them the cuttings of roots and trees. In other words, they showed them medical things. So that was the second reason that he speaks to them. Now, the third reason obviously was the most dramatic, and that's the fact of their mating practices. It goes to talk about in the book of Watchers, the name of the angel that's in charge of this is called Shemahazi. Now, Shemahazi wanted to mate with a human woman. Now, his name means my name has seen. And also, he sees my name. That's what the meaning of his name is. Now, let me read to you from chapter 6 and 7 of the book. And it came to pass when the sons of men had increased that those days there were born to them fair and beautiful daughters. And the angels, the sons of heaven, saw them and desired them. And they said one to another, come, let us choose for ourselves wives from the children of men, and let us beget for ourselves children. And Shemahazi, who was the leader, said to them, I fear that you may not wish this deed to be done, and that I alone will pay the price for the great sin. And they all answered him and said, let us all swear an oath and bind one another with curses, not to alter this plan, but to carry out this plan effectively. And they, the human woman, became pregnant and bore large giants, and their height was the height of 3,000 cubits, which is somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 miles. These devoured all the toil of men until men were unable to sustain them. And the giants turned against them in order to devour them. And they began to sin against the birds and against the animals and against the reptiles and against the fish. And they devoured one another, flesh, and drank from their blood. The earth complained about the lawlessness that was there. Imagine that world. Now, the results of the unnatural cohabiting of these two was obviously going to be what we would call, if nothing else, illicit angels. But these angels then were giants. Now, we're not told how big they really are. In fact, there's several things that relate in other books where they were smaller and some that they were even larger than that. But they were quite noticeable, let's put it that way. Now, there was a third version. Again, I told you about the Slavic version, in which the giants themselves killed each other. Their spirits, however, cannot die because they're angelic, or at least that is the understanding. And because they're angelic and they cannot die, they're immortal. But how do you die if you're immortal? Well, only God can simply destroy them all, and he chose the flood to eliminate the last of them. But what happened to them if they can't die? Some have identified the watchers themselves were taken to a place called Tartarus, which is beneath hell. It is dark and flaming hot. They cannot see, and that's where they rest they don't rest. That's where they're at even to this day. On the other hand, those which are called Nephilim became demons. Enoch 2 goes into the explanation of demonic understanding, because you see, the Bible will mention it, but not to the extent or give us as much information as what Enoch chooses to do. So we're looking at the third version. Here in this version, I want to add, and now the giants who were born from spirits and flesh will be called evil spirits upon the earth, and upon the earth will be their dwelling. So when we look in the Old Testament and even in the New Testament, their dwelling place on this earth is considered to be what we would call a dwelling of an evil spirit. Evil spirits came out from the flesh because from above they were created, and from the holy watchers there was their origin and foundation. Evil spirits will be on the earth, and spirits of the evil ones will be called. And the dwelling of the spirits in heaven is in heaven, but the dwelling of the spirits of the earth who were born on the earth is on earth. And the spirits of the giants who do wrong and are corrupt and attack and fight and break on the earth and cause sorrow, and they eat no food and they have no rest and they are not observed. And these spirits will rise against the sons of men and against the women because they came out from them. So these characters, we lose the watchers. They're down in Tartarus, but their offspring do not technically die. They just lose their physical body. They continue here on the earth. And so this is one of the things that we begin to talk about when the devil made me do it. Well, they're still here. These are the demons that we're talking about. In the version, let me think about this. If I were to give you a copy, I have a copy on the shelf of the Book of Jubilees. You'll find much of this is re-recorded in the Book of Jubilees to either verify or not. But it's not just in Jubilees. We're going to find it in the books of war. We're going to find it in other books that are found in the Qumran area. It is one of those subjects that seemingly goes beyond. And we're going to talk about the Wars of Heaven as another one of those books that appears to have some relationship to what's going on in the book of Revelations when we talk about the third of the angels that fall. All of this is much of what we're talking about has been copied or recopied in civilization after civilization. There is no civilization in ancient times that does not have a flood story. There is no nation in ancient times that does not have these sons of God, only they're not called sons of God. In some places, they're called astronauts. And so you begin to look at all of these characters and you begin to try to put together your own understanding of what we're talking about. So as we go on, I want to talk to you about why did the Second Temple period choose to eliminate this book? Because that's where it happened. Well, there's basic thoughts. One is not only why the flood actually occurred, but also when it actually occurred. And according to the Watchers, human evil becomes unbearable. That's the subject for the flood. Becomes unbearable. Evil spirits are still active in the audiences because they don't die. They simply can move across the waters. The second part of this story is it addresses the fact that evil spirits are still active in our present day. At least that's what Enoch was telling us. There's no end to them. So we have a tug of war that's going on. And there's a lot of things that are talked about. There's a book called The Song of Songs, another one of the Qumran books. In it, it speaks of his angels he put in my heart the praises of his righteousness. And by his mouth, he frightens all of the spirits of the bastards to subdue. The bastards are the Nephilim, the uncleanness of them. For in the innards of my flesh is the foundation of my body are battles. The statutes of God are in my heart, and I profit from all the wonders of man, and the works of guilt I condemned because of God. As you're going through this whole section, one of the things that becomes interesting is the fact that there's this battle for my body. The idea of demons, the idea of trying to get me to perform evil acts, move in the wrong direction. The fact that it's the statutes of God are in my heart. In other words, significant way to defeat the angelic demonic realm is through the understanding of the laws, what they stand for. Human desire creates sin. In fact, from a powerful evil spirits explains that struggling members of what was going on in Qumran, because in Qumran, remember the Essenes who left the temple because the temple had become so polluted. There was no longer a high priest who was a priest. He was an appointed person from the Greek and the Romans. So the empire was beginning to take over everything. So the Essenes left and moved south into the Dead Sea region. They're living along the line of the Jordan Valley. They built their little community called Qumran. The members in that community, they say they were all males, but we found recently that there are actually female bodies there. So it was families that actually went down to Qumran. And here again, they were there for the purposes of getting away from as much evil as possible, knowing that they're still evil. We know that they also were great at historical writings. They spent a lot of time writing the different books of the Tanakh, several copies of Isaiah, several copies of Jeremiah. All these books were down there. And so they had written them. Then there were partial books, scroll pieces that had just simply disintegrated over time. All of that was down there. But they found themselves almost cloistering like you would find a monk, in the sense of getting away from. And that's where they were at. Now, first Enoch appears to have played a part in their thinking and the thinking of other Jewish writers. Just like I said, we know Daniel has some of these. But there's a rabbi named Gershom Scholem, who is probably one of the, well, he's passed away now. He died in, I think it was 87, was a great mystic who used Enoch and used Jubilees, and he used those books themselves to help him understand Kabbalah. Because you see, Kabbalah is a combination of things. It's not just a single thought. It's a philosophy. And it's a philosophy that's been built over time. And so that's what's going on. So he keeps track of the traditions. And among the traditions of differences, what he believes between when Moses came across and now during the days of Enoch, later during the days of men like Baal Shem Tov, or the days of the Arizal, constantly increasing and improving on our understanding. Now, Jude in the New Testament quotes directly from the first book of Enoch. St. Peter, or who we might call St. Peter, if you're Catholic, I was at one time. St. Peter is found in both of his books, First Peter and Second Peter, not direct quotes, but dialogue that hints of Enoch. You see, the stories themselves, whether people wanted to canonize them or not, were still drifting through. We know that there are stories that are always told, and a midrash is a story. So there's constant stories that are floating through time, and these stories become significant because they give pieces of information or they help us understand things. So this was what was going on. By the 3rd century CE, neither the Jews nor the Christians would even touch the book of Enoch. But back in about 1800s, all of a sudden, scrolls were found that had been in Ethiopia, and they now began to flourish, and people began to see them. Then along came the Qumran scrolls. All of those were found. Now, in the book of Enoch, it's a treasure. It's a part of the Bible for the Ethiopian Jew, the Falashi Jew. So that's one of the differences between the Jews that we would normally think of and the Falashi Jews. They actually have canonized that book. Now, First Enoch then obviously has fallen into favor, and now it is no longer out of favor, but it's actually a book that we're actually studying or can study. Now, the date of First Enoch, well, it appears as though it was written in the 3rd century BCE. Daniel was prior to that. But many people say because Daniel had so much prophecy in it, he couldn't be. He must have been in the 1st century so he could actually go back and pick up some of these stories. But any way you look at it, these are the beginnings of the Apocrypha writings, the beginnings of the writings of what the end will be about. And so that's what our story is going to hinge on. So again, we begin to find the history through the world and into the end of days. We also begin to pick up this trail of demons and the effects of demonology, the effects of it has on the people around it. Now, the book of Mark talks about demons, only he doesn't call them demons. He calls them instead unclean spirits or impure spirits. Code words, I guess, if you want, of what's going on. But listen to first Enoch. And in those days they shall be led off to the abyss of fire, and to the torment and the prison in which they shall be confined forever, and destroy all the spirits of the reprobate and of the children of the watchers, because of the harm they have caused humans. Same idea rolls through the Gospels, the idea of permanent hell. That's what they're talking about, or talking to. So the book of Enoch has had a tremendous effect on the Old Testament and the New Testament. In fact, I want to give you a hint of second Enoch, because it's going to be someplace where I might be going. I find as I'm teaching this, I get more excited. I don't know if you can tell it from my voice. But one of the things that becomes most obvious to me is there's a lot of information here that deals with something that we would call extraterrestrial. Now, there's a rabbi that writes for, actually part of a production company dealing with aliens and alien spacecraft. But this is going to be something that's a part of Enoch also. Enoch, in his third chapter of the first Enoch, spends his time talking about astronomy, spends his time talking about going himself personally through space with Uriel, which is one of the archangels, by the way, goes through space, understands the organization of the planets, understands the relationship of stars. In fact, he was so precise that there was a group of stars in which there were a three-star cluster that he named that is still in existence, or at least the astronomers understand it to be. So we're looking at something that is far into the future. But more scary than that, I don't know if you've ever read Gulliver's Travels. If you've ever read Gulliver's Travels, you'll know that Gulliver finds out about the twin moons of Mars. In the days of Gulliver, there were no twin moons. The second moon, Deimos, demon, was not found until the early 19th, 20th century, when the telescopes became bright enough. Lots of the stories that we're going to pick up are going to come rolling out of some of these legends and some of these other stories. Nobody knows how it goes. But in the second book of Enoch, the first 22 chapters deals with Enoch himself and the fact that he will be taken at the age of 365, and that two angels come from heaven and they escort him through the heavens. He will go through all 7 or all 10 levels of heaven. There are 7 groups of angels according to Enoch, and there are 10 levels of heaven. The 10 levels of heaven are found in Kabbalistic writings, so it's not something that is new. In the second section, he talks about being guided by Gabriel, and Gabriel takes him into the throne room, into the 10th heaven, where he meets with God face to face. As you go through this, you also find that God throws him and his order down, meaning the watchers. The angels are thrown down. In other words, God has cast them out, if you will. It also speaks in the language, I didn't copy it, I should have. Speaks in the language where you find the idea of descending from orbit. God throws them down, so they remain here, and in this case, in the bottomless pit. And this is the story that's similar to the story that's found in the War in the Heavens, which is another one of those scrolls that are found. As you can see, there's lots of scrolls. But what's interesting about the scroll that's in heaven, or the War in Heaven, is the character. It's a war between God and Hasatan. Hasatan. Only he's not called Hasatan, he's called Satanael. Satanael. If you read the book of Job and you read the first 2 chapters, Satan, well, incorrectly, they tell us that Satan came to be with all the other angels and standing before God. But there's a very significant part of that story. First off, Satan is not a noun. In this case, it's ha-Satan. It's an adjective. It describes one who is in opposition to. He's an opposer. He is a prosecutor. So as our book goes on, the war is between the prosecutor and God. The war is between the innocent and the evil ones. Ha-Satan wants to take on everyone. Ha-Satan, Satanel, happens to be the character that they find in the book of the Genesis, the Garden of Eden story, where we say that Satan came and camouflaged himself in a serpent's body. They have a similar story in the War of Heaven. You go on from there, and the fact that there's another angel who will come to him, whose name is Ver-Evel, and he dictates to him 360 books. Those books are to be kept and understood by other people because they have the secrets of the angels. Now, I don't know, I haven't found any of those books yet, going through what I have looked at, but it has a very like sounding to the book of Job in the 36, 37, 38 chapters when he talks about creation, and he talks about all of the things that are involved in creation. How great is my creation? Can you imagine? The same thing holds up in the War of Heaven, the idea of creation. Now, there's a third section that deals with, well, it's 38 to 68, and it deals with ethical issues or instructions, giving us moral understanding, a compass to live by. And then finally, the last section of the thing deals with Melchizedek, whom Enoch says was his great, 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 great grandson, and that he was part of the priestly line that had been established through Enoch. But Enoch was no longer walking. He passed it on to his son called Ner. Ner now became the priest, and he passed it on, and Melchizedek has it. In our understanding, Melchizedek was from the tribe of Shem, or was from the son of Shem. He was Shem, and that's where we have differences in what's going on. I want to show you the 10 heavens because that seems to be significant. If we go through it, it looks like this. The first heaven is just above the firmament, where the angels control the atmospheric phenomena, such as the storehouses of snow and rain and water above. That's the idea of that. The second heaven is the heaven where Enoch finds darkness. It's a prison where rebel angels are tortured. Now, the third heaven he sees both paradise, represented by the Garden of Eden, which is also guarded by angels, and hell, where man or bad men are tortured. I don't know if you've ever had a college class where you took Dante's Inferno. It's a trilogy, actually. The first day he goes from, on the night of the crucifixion, goes into hell, and he goes through the levels of hell. Then in the Saturday, he spends his time in what we call paradise, or he calls what we would call the middle level and purgatory. Then from there, he rises on the third day, and when he rises, he goes to heaven. So he goes through this process. Some of those same ideas show up in the book of Enoch. The fourth heaven is a place of the movements of the sun and the moon, which are described in detail. Around the sun, he sees angelic creatures known as the phoenix, which also reside in the sixth heaven. There is also on this level a heavenly choir comprising soldiers of angels who are singing wondrously and marvelously. The fifth level is talking about Enoch finds for himself Grigori, soldiers of Satan that look like human beings, but they're giants. This is the group I think that they're talking about on the second side of the flood. They are in a state of limbo at this point, having not yet been condemned, and Enoch convinced them to repent. And that's another whole section. God entrusted to him to go to the evil angels and get them to repent, which they choose not to. Well, the sixth level of heaven, he sees angels in charge of governing the cosmos and people. And these are the archangels who are above angels, measure all life in human and on earth, and the angels who are appointed over seasons and over years, and angels who are over rivers and seas and over the fruit on the earth, and angels who are over every grass, giving food to all, to every living thing, and the angels who write all the souls of men, who write all the souls of men and all their deeds and their lives before the Lord's face. The seventh angel, or seventh heaven, deals with Enoch, who is now guided by Gabriel and is allowed to enter and to see the legions of God's angels living before him in a bright light. The next group of angels is below the upper firmament, in which are stuck the constellations. Here we have what they call the Mazalot, the 12 constellations by which we have our understandings of horoscopes and those kinds of things, only it's not quite correctly done the way it should. But anyway, that's another story. The ninth heaven is the upper firmament, in which are fixed the constellations and the changers of the seasons, which goes back to the book of Genesis, back to that first chapter dealing with seasons and time. The 10th level is the final level, and that's where God's throne would actually reside, and God met Enoch face to face at that point. Now, Enoch is not going to return at this point. He will now be permanently in heaven. Only his name will be changed. He will become Metatron. He will become the head of all angels. That will be his new task. Now, later on in chapter 69 into 73, we again take a look at this exalted Melchizedek, but that's for another story. I want to go from here. I want to talk about a place called Ugarit. Ugarit is a little city. It's no longer in existence. It's just now a place where if you were to go there, you will find lots of stone. It is the place that was in it's in northwest Syria. It's right along the Mediterranean Sea itself. And here we find stories of the gods, or a story of God, in which God is called El Yahweh. El Yahweh is 2/3 God and 1/3 human. He got that way by marriage. His wife's name is Asherah. We know her from all the Balaam stories and all the stories in the Old Testament. Asherah was very important. Now, they include the likes of other gods that lived in Ugarit: Baal, Anat, Astarte, Yam, and Mot. All of them were there. And among them are the fallen angels called Nephilim. Now, the reason I think this is my thoughts, the reason the author chose to mention the Nephilim in our Bible is partly because of the descriptions that may have occurred from other sources. You and I both know that Avram, now called Abraham, lived in a place we call Ur of Chaldees. Ur of Chaldees was at one time part of the Sumerian territory. And I don't know if you have ever read anything about the Sumerians. The Sumerian stories, the Epic of Gilgamesh is the story of the flood, are very, very similar. And again, when they talk about the fallen ones, they talk about those who are thrown down, forced down. And the idea is that there may be some connection between those legends and the legends that we have today. We also know that there are other places that have legends. We also know that the Egyptians had many legends that went along the same line. We know if we look at the pyramids, there is no way in the last 6,000 years anybody could have created such a thing. But the problem is that those pyramids are not just in Egypt. We find them in Mexico. We find them in Turkey. We find them across the world. There are all kinds of stories of how they got here. One of the pyramids, when they went in, actually found pictures of what looked like men sitting in spaceships. There seems to be a lot of stories that lead us to other stories, and a lot of things that make other things seem insignificant or unsure. But we get this idea. And so I asked the question, or I posed the question, so why did Moses, who's working with God, choose to put a story in here that leaves us with so many questions about fallen angels, about astronauts, whatever have you? Why is it here? Moses was supposed to be teaching us about the religion. And the Sumerians had a very similar story that had a very similar understanding. The character talked to us about their religion, their understanding. Well, actually, it's not a religion, it's their ethics. The fallen ones were to blame for the rapid increase of depravity. That's obvious. But it's obvious in all of the other civilizations. They all speak to the same thing. You continue on, you come to the understanding pride was very significant. In the days of chapter 10 and 11, chapter 10 and 11, when we deal with the Tower of Babel, the Tower of Babel itself was a pyramid-shaped object reaching into the heavens. When Lot was taken, along with the other 5 nations, by Chelamar and his men with him, one of the groups was called giants. Chelamar himself was supposedly a giant. So giants are appearing, but they're called giants, not called Nephilim, although Moses alludes to one in his story. I want you to understand that the legacy of the Nephilim just doesn't end at the flood, because we seem to carry it across to the other side. I want you to go back and look in your Bible at Genesis chapter 6, and I want us to look at verse 4 again, one more time, to see my conundrum. Chapter 6, verse number 4. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterwards. So how did they get to the other side if they weren't all killed in the flood? If they only became what we would call spiritual demons? How did they make it to the other side? That's the question. There are some people that have answers, or at least they've tried to give me answers to this. Here's part of the theory. One theory holds that they were like Og. They reference Og as the original gangster. But anyway, besides that, Og was a Nephilim. He survived by clinging to the side of the ark, and he was fed by one of the women on the ark. That's what theory 1. The problem is his brother also survived, because we are told in the book of Deuteronomy, Sihon was also brother to Og. So how could he get across if only Og made it across? The second theory holds in Genesis that the fallen angels themselves had sexual relations, and as a result, the human body was changed. The genes inside of a woman began to change. And in that change, created for us on the other side what we would call Nephilim, or what we should rightly call giants. Another theory also is based in Genesis chapter 6, is that the fallen angels, having knowledge of human genetics, demons indwelling certain women and men. And in that case, again, creating for us giants. Another theory is that the giants were simply the result of just normal genetic variabilities in our society. Some are tall, some are short. Noah, remember, cursed Ham, and in doing so, he didn't curse Ham, he cursed Canaan. If we go back and look at all of the stories regarding Joshua, Moses, all the angels or all the giants that are located in there have a Canaanite background. Was the curse put upon them to have giants? And were those giants then something else? We know that one character, the Gittites, had 5 men, only 5 of their men were giants. The leader of that group of 5 was Goliath. Goliath was the child of a rape, and in which case she had Goliath. Her name was Orpah. We know her best in the book of Ruth. She's the one that turned around and went home. So we have lots of things to think about. Also, it's explained that giants were on one side of the flood were not the same as the ones on the other side, because obviously the spies never saw a Nephilim, but they did see giants. So are the Nephilim giants, or are the giants simply giants? Now, the story of the Raphim, which is a large order, Rapha means to heal. It's a healing. But we're told that Raphaim speaks of the dead ones. So are these the product of dead ones? Are these the products of the Nephilim? And if so, how? So we come to this understanding that there's a lot of possibilities in what's going on here. And as I go through this, well, let me stop here. And next time I'm going to go through the giants themselves. And I'm going to talk about each group of giants, because it leads me to further depth, further study. But I wanted you to get an understanding of just the Nephilim and how much of that story has stories that go in all kinds of directions. Those 4 verses are filled with study, but yet they're there. And so as we go through, hopefully we can make sense of them as we go through. But anyway, let me stop here. Anybody, I'm sure you followed me perfectly, but anybody have questions or ideas or understandings that you want to talk about, or questions about the giants that I haven't talked about?